Good morning. 2 minutes late, but we're on. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, the 2015 Atlantic Hurricane Season Outlook. I'm Ed Goldberg with the Association of Contingency Planners. The ACP webinar series is sponsored by Continuity Housing. Continuity Housing provides housing for your critical personnel when you need it most. Has the active hurricane cycle that began in 1995 come to an end? And if so, what does this mean for 2015 and beyond? With the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina just a few months away, many are beginning to wonder about the relative lull in storm activity over the last several years and, most importantly, if that trend is expected to continue. Among the many updated topics covered today will be whether the recent active cycle in the Atlantic, which started in 1995, is coming to an end. Recent changes in the tropics may indicate that a cool phase is beginning, and yet we had Tropical Storm Anna make landfall on Sunday morning, 3 weeks before the official start of the hurricane season, which is why we're very fond of saying that it's not the season you prepare for, it's the storm. Our presenter today is Chris Hebert, lead hurricane forecaster for Storm Geo, formerly known as Impact Weather, and manager of the Tropics Watch team. With a BS in meteorology from Texas A&M University in 1980 and 35 years of forecasting experience, Chris's duties include leading the hurricane team year-round, and the team forecasts tropical cyclones in all basins of the world, not just the Atlantic. Besides covering southern hemisphere tropical cyclones during the winter months, Chris heads the marine fog team, producing forecasts of marine fog and port and channel closures all along the Gulf Coast. And in addition, Chris assists the Storm Watch team in forecasting major winter storms. One of Chris's main duties during the spring is traveling the country to speak about hurricanes at conventions, seminars, and corporate meetings. Topics typically include hurricane preparedness, hurricane forecasting, Storm Geo's hurricane timeline tools, and outlooks for the upcoming hurricane season. We're thrilled to have Chris with us today. Thank you very much for presenting today, Chris, and welcome.
Well, thank you. I want to start out, before we go into what we're expecting over the coming hurricane season, to take a quick look back at last season, which was generally quiet, except if you were on the island of Bermuda, which got hit by 2 hurricanes within the span of just a 7-day period last October. So not very quiet out there in the open Atlantic, but in the island of Bermuda, but generally quiet throughout the Caribbean Sea and quiet in the Gulf of Mexico last year. It's been a long time since the last Category 3 or 4 or 5 hurricanes struck the United States coastline. As we move into June of this year, 3,507 days, almost 10 years. If we look back in time at from 1851 to present, we can see that this is by far the longest span we've gone without a Category 3 or greater hurricane striking the United States coastline. There were a couple of dates back in the early 1860s, it looks like, in the early 1900s, when there were about a 4 or 5 day period without a 4 or 5 year period without a major hurricane landfall. But we've gone quite a bit farther than that this past 9 years. Last Category 3 or greater hurricane to strike the United States coastline was Hurricane Wilma on October 24th of 2005. Now, Sandy did strike the Northeast U.S. as a low-end, barely Category 1 hurricane. It was classified as non-tropical by the time it reached the coast, but it did produce some hurricane conditions. Even though it produced a lot of damage, it wasn't a Category 3 or greater hurricane. So it's been a long time since we've had a major Category 3 or 4 or 5 hurricane striking the United States coastline. Well, as we look forward to the 2015 hurricane season, we've heard talk about El Nino developing out there. We thought we'd have an El Nino developing last season, and it took a while to get going, but it looks like it's finally developing out there in the Pacific Ocean. And when the warm waters, when the Pacific water temperatures in the deep tropics warm up, we tend to have more tropical development in the eastern Pacific over here, and we tend to have more rising air in the Pacific. We tend to have sinking air in the Caribbean Sea and in the tropical Atlantic. It also tends to produce unfavorable winds aloft. We call that wind shear. That makes development very difficult for tropical storms in the Caribbean Sea and in the deep tropics primarily. Not so much of an impact on the Gulf of Mexico, however, but it's going to be a significant detrimental factor this year if it gets as strong as some of the models are forecasting. As we look at the water temperatures out in the tropical Pacific, we can see they're well above normal from the tropics all the way toward the Gulf of Alaska this year. Not by any means warm up there in the Gulf of Alaska, just above normal temperatures as far as the water temperatures up in that region. And the forecast for the coming season is that we're going to see continually rising temperatures. The current temperature is a little bit over 1 degree Celsius above normal. You can look back last year, just about in October, the water temperatures rose into that El Nino threshold of plus 0.5 Celsius above normal, and they've been continuing to rise ever since. Some of the models are forecasting a rather strong El Nino, nearly as strong as a 1997 El Nino this year, and that should be a significant inhibiting factor for development this season. Looking over toward the Atlantic Ocean, and this is the chart I just got today, it's from yesterday. The water temperature is now well below normal from Africa through the Caribbean Sea, below normal in the Caribbean Sea, and even below normal in the southern Gulf of Mexico now. Only areas above normal are in the central Gulf of Mexico, that'd be the loop current there, and off the southeast U.S. coast. We have some above normal temperatures in that region as well, but generally cooler Atlantic waters. It's going to be less energy for hurricanes to intensify this season. If we look back, and you talked about the seasonal, what's called a multi-decadal oscillation, where we have warm and cold cycles in the Atlantic Basin. This is a graphic from 1950 to present, and this is just for April, the month of April, looking at water temperatures out there. And right now, rather cool out there in the tropical Atlantic. Almost as cool as any period between now and 1950, even during the one of the last warm cycles that, well, it started actually in 1926, and I'll show you a graphic that shows that right here. In 1926, we had the last warm cycle starting. It went through 1969. Now, if we look at the temperatures in the Atlantic Basin annually versus April, we can see that right now we're at about minus 0.5 degrees Celsius, cooler than normal. But if you look back in some of the previous warm cycles, well, 1926 to 1969, there were two periods in there where the water cooled down, got down below what it is now, and then eventually warmed back up. And there were still 15 more years of above normal activity in the Atlantic Basin. And even back in the 1800s here, we had a period when it was cooler than it is now. But just because the water temperatures now in the main development region are below normal doesn't mean it's going to stay like that for years to come. I think that this is probably a temporary dip like we've seen in previous warm cycles, and I think we're going to see rising temperatures over the next few years, but not this season. I think they're going to remain cool. We're not out of that warm cycle yet, and during a warm cycle, we typically get about 4 major hurricanes per season. Cool cycle, we only get about 1 or 2 major hurricanes. And that's a big influence as far as the intensity of the storms out there in the tropics. I don't think we're quite out of the warm cycle yet, but certainly for this season, it's going to be cool out there, and we're going to see less intense hurricanes. The European model's done a very good job in recent years in predicting the pressures and the rainfall out in the deep tropics and the development. Last year it predicted that activity would be about 70% of normal, and it was right about 70% of normal last year. This year, for August through October, the European model is predicting higher pressure in the deep tropics, all the way from Africa through the Gulf of Mexico. And along with that higher pressure comes sinking air. We tend to have less rainfall in this region, and that means that disturbances in the deep tropics are probably going to be struggling again as they were last season in the deep tropics. We didn't have any activity at all in the Caribbean Sea last year, and this year I think it's going to be quiet in the deep tropics as it was last year. One of the tools that we can use to take a look at, well, what's going to happen in the future is by looking back at the previous seasons with a similar setup going into the hurricane season. We look at the status of El Nino or La Nina, and we look at the temperatures in the Atlantic Basin and try to determine or try to find a season in the past that has a similar setup of ocean temperatures in the Atlantic and the Pacific, jet stream patterns across the Atlantic Basin to what we're seeing right now. And by finding such seasons, we can perhaps identify a development or a tracking trend that might give a clue as to what to expect this season. If we look back at some of the better analog years, we can see that in general they weren't producing very many storms at all. The Caribbean Sea, not much activity in the Caribbean Sea in any of these seasons. We did have one East Coast impact, that was Bob in 1991 that hit Long Island, but for the most part, fewer than 10 named storms, rather quiet in the Caribbean Sea, and and generally quiet in the Gulf, except that occasionally we do get some development in the Gulf of Mexico during these analog years, and 1957 is also one of those analog seasons. We didn't have any activity in the Gulf in 1957. We had only 3 hurricanes, and 2 of them were intense, one up in here in the middle of the Atlantic Basin, but in mid-June to late June, we had Hurricane Audrey develop in the south central Gulf of Mexico, quickly developed to a Category 4 hurricane, moved into southwest Louisiana, and caused quite a bit of damage and loss of life. Not a whole lot of warning back then. It only took a couple of days from the time it developed to the time it moved inland, and it did strengthen during the night before moving inland. So it was a very damaging storm that developed close in, and I think that's one of the things that we're going to have to watch out for this season as we look toward the forecast for the season. Generally, I think most areas are going to be below normal as far as the chance of a hurricane impact. We're looking at a relatively quiet, deep tropics on here. I don't think that we're going to see much threat to the lesser Antilles or even most of the greater Antilles. Perhaps western Cuba might be an area where the activity, potential impact of a hurricane might be a little bit, well, at least close to normal. And also along the northern Gulf Coast to the South Florida, I think that area may be close to normal in terms of the hurricane threat. We're looking at about 8 named storms. We've already had 1 out there, Ana, 4 of them to become hurricanes, and 2 of them intense Category 3 or 4 or 5 hurricanes this season. Now, the prime development area that we're looking at this year, I think, will be north of the Caribbean, just as it was last year. Secondarily, we have to look toward the Gulf of Mexico for development, close in. I think we'll see some disturbances move across from Africa through the Caribbean Sea and struggle, probably not developing until they reach the Northwest Caribbean Sea or perhaps the Gulf of Mexico. And once they develop there, typically we don't have very much heads up before the storm develops and moves on into the coastline, just like we had in 1957, and we have to watch for something like that developing close in this year. I don't think we're going to have an active season like 2004 or 5 as far as the number of storms in the Gulf. I think we may get 1 hurricane, and it could be a strong hurricane developing in the Gulf, moving toward the northern Gulf Coast. As far as the names that we're looking at this year, we're looking at, with 8 named storms, we'll probably get down through Henri. We've already had Ana. Don't think we'll make it down to Ida or Joaquin or Kate this year. Well, there's always a slight chance we could have a few more hurricanes out there, but I think we'll pretty much stay around 8 named storms this year, and those are the names for the 2015 hurricane season. So with that, I think that we've come to the end of my part of the presentation here, and I'll take any questions that we might have.
Great, Chris. I was just looking at the names. I guess I'll ask a question about that after, but that's always a mystery to me. I'll ask it now. What the heck? It seems like every time there's a storm up here, I'm in the Northeast, all the storms have 2 names. There's some weather folks use one name and some use another, and I don't understand where that comes from.
I'm not sure what names you're talking about, but they only have 1 list of names for the Atlantic Basin. Sometimes the Weather Channel names some of these winter systems.
That's what it is. Yeah,
we're talking about tropical storms and hurricanes here, and there's only 1 set of names.
Okay. Was Ana really a tropical storm, and why did they keep calling it subtropical?
Well, it eventually became a tropical storm. It started out from a disturbance. It was mainly an upper-level feature that moved off across the Gulf of Mexico and was semi-associated with a frontal boundary that was sitting off the southeast U.S. coast. So it developed as more of a frontal type of low-pressure area initially. It didn't have the squalls near the center, the warm core that a hurricane or tropical cyclone has. It was more of a wintertime low-pressure system. But sometimes those type of lows can develop tropical characteristics. They get a tighter wind field, more intense squalls near the center, and that's what Ana did over time as it sat over the Gulf Stream. It did develop a warm core that we look for tropical cyclones. Then it was eventually called Tropical Storm Ana. Now, as far as what does it mean for the rest of the season, we've already had one in early May. Does this mean we're going to have a very active season? No, not at all. Not when they form from non-tropical features like cold fronts and upper-level lows along the U.S. coastline. If Ana had developed from a disturbance coming from Africa and tracked across the Caribbean Sea, then that would be a strong signal for a very active season, being a tropical origin of a system. But as it was, it is not a signal that we're going to be seeing anything as far as a very active season, just because we had something like that develop off the East Coast.
Great. That was actually one of the questions, so that's terrific.
I figured.
You anticipated it. Could 2015 be a little more favorable for tropical storm formation in the Gulf of Mexico, Northwest Caribbean, and the north part of the Atlantic than last year? I think we sort of covered it.
Well, we have warm water in the Gulf of Mexico. Warm water is a requirement, but it just by itself, it doesn't mean that we're going to have development there. I was talking to Dr. Phil Klotzbach over at a conference a few weeks ago about the Gulf of Mexico during El Nino seasons like we're seeing now, and many of those analog seasons were El Nino year. 1965 was an El Nino year. We had Betsy, a Category 4, move into southeast Louisiana that year. Andrew, 1992, hit South Florida, then Louisiana. That was an El Nino year. Alicia, upper Texas coast, 1983, an El Nino year. What we found is that although El Nino tends to suppress activity in the deep tropics, and we don't tend to see much East U.S. coast hit, many East U.S. coast hits during an El Nino, the Gulf of Mexico doesn't respond well at all. It's just about as good a chance as ever of having a storm in the Gulf of Mexico, particularly when they don't develop all the way from Africa to the northwestern Caribbean Sea. Then you're almost assured of getting something developing in the Gulf of Mexico during an El Nino year. So we have to watch out for that this year.
Yeah, I remember some years where the waves coming off of Africa were like a pitching machine. It just was nonstop.
95.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we stay away from those. Will there be more dry air this year?
Last year we had dry air in multiple levels. We started out the season with that what we call a Saharan air layer, and this happens when the Bermuda high that sits out there in the tropical Atlantic gets stronger, and it tends to blow stronger across the Saharan desert. The easterly winds there and the trade winds increase and pull a lot of that dust from the Sahara across the tropics all the way to sometimes the southern U.S. And that's in the lower few thousand feet of the atmosphere. We had a lot of that last year, even through August, a very intense outbreak of Saharan air. And that's certainly not favorable for tropical cyclones to develop in. But in addition, we had the stronger high pressure in the Atlantic. That Bermuda high was stronger, and we tended to have more sinking air across the deep tropics in the mid and upper levels. So not only was it dry at the surface, but it was dry in the mid and dry in the upper parts of the atmosphere last year. We're seeing signals that it's going to be just as dry this year. I don't know yet about the Saharan air layer, that low-level dryness that we typically see early season. We do have a significant outbreak right now, that Saharan air, and it's possible it may be the same situation out there in 2015 that we saw last year. It was a lot of dry air at all levels.
Okay. Does fewer storms in a given season mean that the ones that develop will be stronger?
Not necessarily that case. Just because there are less storms doesn't mean all the energy is going to be reserved for a lesser number of storms. When we have fewer storms, we're going to have fewer hurricanes. We're going to have fewer of those Category 3 or greater hurricanes. We call those major hurricanes. And I don't think just because we have less storms, we're going to have all the energy into one. I think that with the environmental conditions that we're seeing out there, it would lend itself to, they would lend it toward smaller storms this year, because the pockets of favorable weather may be smaller across the tropics. So we might not have the gigantic storms like Rita or Katrina or Ivan that we saw in 2004 and 2005. But we may see some smaller storms like we saw in 2002 with Lily, Category 4 in the northern Gulf of Mexico. It wasn't very large, but it got to be very intense. So I think we're going to see some smaller storms on average, smaller hurricanes, than we typically would when the whole Caribbean Sea and Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic is favorable.
Yep. So a good segue to this question. What's the expected category of close-in hurricanes that form in the Gulf of Mexico?
Well, hurricanes can develop very, very quickly. We had Wilma, the last Category 3 or greater hurricane, hit the United States. When it was in the Caribbean Sea, it went from a tropical storm, a low-end tropical storm, to a Category 5 within 24 hours.
Wow.
Katrina did nearly the same thing in the Gulf of Mexico. It takes very little time for them to intensify once they move over the warm water, particularly that central Gulf where we have the deeper loop current water coming out of the Caribbean Sea. The just because it develops in the Gulf doesn't mean it can't be strong. Audrey is an example. 1957, it was a Category 4 hurricane, and within about 24 to 36 hours of spinning up. So they can spin up very quickly. Usually, though, you could say that probably more often than not, they're not the more intense hurricanes, but they certainly, it's nothing to prevent them if they have a favorable environment.
Yeah, yeah, okay. You talked about this briefly, I sort of alluded to it, but do you recall any similar seasons where there was a very, very early storm, subtropical as you described, or other, and what did those seasons ended up being like? Is there a correlation between an early storm and the nature of the season?
It really depends on the origin of the early storm. If the early storm is non-tropical origins, not much correlation. In a lot of the seasons, I've looked back at about 5 or 6 or 7 that had developments in early to mid-April, and generally they were during more active cycles when they were tropical of origin, and there was between 15 or 18 named storms those seasons. But when they develop from non-tropical systems, there's not much correlation there, and I don't think that it's any indication we're going to see a more active season.
Okay, that's fair. What impact let's see. What's on the immediate horizon for the next 2 to 3 weeks? That was one question.
As far as potential development out there now, we're not seeing any sign of activity in the deep tropics right now. There's still too much wind shear across the area, and there are not any significant disturbances yet moving off the coast of Africa. So everything looks pretty quiet. Models aren't hinting at anything now. Like they did hit an Anna from about a week to 2 weeks out and ahead of it. They did indicate development in that region, but they're not indicating anything now. It looks like it's going to be very quiet next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's just amazing to me. You know, you mentioned the European model that, you know, now people, lay people, if you will, from your perspective, that talk about the different models. And in fact, when Sandy came, you know, up here in the Northeast, we were watching that for upwards of 10 days. We were really just kind of just sitting and waiting, almost as if we were confident and knew what was going to happen. And that's almost creepy, I have to tell you.
Well, the European model did very well with Sandy, pegging it about 8 or 9 days out in advance that it would be a threat to New Jersey and Long Island. The American model is not quite up to par with the European model for a number of reasons. I won't get into it right now. But it doesn't mean that every storm, the European model is the one to watch. It did well with Sandy, but it may do poorly with the next storm. It all depends on the situation.
I remember some of the winter storms that didn't do so well. They talked about that at length. Here's the last question. We'll go to wrap up. But what impact will a moderate to strong El Nino have on the California drought?
Well, we're seeing an impact starting now. Now, we expected the El Nino to get going earlier during the winter months, and it didn't. But typically when we have an El Nino, we have a more active southern storm stream. We're certainly seeing that across Texas. It's one of the wetter springs we've ever seen here right now. It hasn't made it out west to California yet, but as we move into fall and into the winter, I think we're still going to be looking at a moderate to strong El Nino, and that could set Southern California and the California coast in general up for a wet fall and winter. Not quite during the summer yet, though.
Okay, very good. If you get a chance, can you move to the last slide? And and I'm gonna wrap us up. Chris Hebert from Storm Geo, thank you so much. This is a great presentation. Sure. And I'd like to thank everybody that's tuned in for attending, and ask that you please take 30 seconds when it pops up at the end to complete the survey. Doing so helps us a great deal to be more productive, to have instructive webinars, get topics that fit your needs. Please let us know how we can help your organization by providing housing for your critical personnel when you need it most. For Storm Geo's Chris Hebert and Continuity Housing and the Association of Contingency Planners, I'm Ed Goldberg. Thank you all again, and have a great weekend.